This is the Novaya Zemlya archipelago. It's one of the most heavily bombed places on the planet, sticking out like a sore thumb off Russia's northern coast in the Arctic Ocean. This is a place that you have no doubt noticed if you've ever looked at a map of Russia. And yet, it's a place that most people know very little about. For our purposes today, Novaya Zemlya is the perfect place to start a discussion on Russia's modern nuclear arsenal, because this archipelago reveals a sharp contrast between the Soviet Union's nuclear capabilities and modern Russia's current capacity today. This, in turn, helps us answer what is perhaps the most critical question of them all. Are Russia's modern nukes as scary as they seem? On Novaya Zemlya, there is a very dark history. If you were to visit the islands, you would find mostly snow, ice, rocks, and a whole lot of residual nuclear radiation, which mostly sits within large glaciers that are now rapidly melting off into the Arctic Ocean. But you would also find something else: a long-abandoned and recently reinstated Soviet Union nuclear testing site, whose abandonment and reinstatement are quite significant when considering the severity of Russian nuclear threats over the war in Ukraine. Over the years, at the hands of this nuclear facility, this archipelago has been blanketed in nuclear radiation from over 220 different nuclear blasts, which have released an energy equivalent to 265 megatons of TNT. That's a lot of explosives. For comparison, during World War II, all of the combined explosives used, even when including the detonations of 2 US nuclear bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, amounted to a total of only 2 to 5 megatons, potentially over 100 times less than what has been seen on just this remote Russian archipelago. And of all this explosive power on Novaya Zemlya, 50 megatons, or close to 1/5, came from just one bomb, the infamous Tsar Bomba, which produced the largest human-made explosion in history, alongside one of history's largest fear propaganda campaigns, which would help contribute to the Cuban Missile Crisis almost exactly 1 year later. Looking at the details, it's easy to see why people were so terrified of this and other Soviet nukes. The mushroom cloud from the Tsar Bomba was approximately 40 miles high, 7 times higher than Mount Everest. The width at the top of the cloud was 59 miles, and the bottom was 25 miles wide, an unfathomable scale. The flash from the Tsar Bomba was so powerful that it was witnessed from over 1,000 kilometers away, and could have caused third-degree burns to any humans or animals within a 100-kilometer distance. Wooden houses over 160 kilometers away were completely flattened, and windows as far as 1,000 kilometers away were shattered by the shockwave, as the bomb also simultaneously created seismic activity equivalent to a magnitude 5 earthquake, which could still be detected even after circumventing the Earth 3 times. This single Soviet bomb was 1,570 times more powerful than the combined yield of the atomic bombs the United States dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and at least 10 times more powerful than all of the conventional weapons exploded during World War II combined. If such a weapon were ever to explode over a large American city such as New York, Chicago, San Francisco, or Washington, D.C., those cities, along with their entire metropolitan areas and surrounding suburbs, would almost certainly be completely destroyed, and devoid of nearly all life. For the Soviet Union, it was a major propaganda victory. The fear the Tsar Bomba created was captivating, helping to contribute to a feeling of dread and terror that has permeated much of the world for at least half a century, something that has defined modern geopolitics and the genre of dystopian fantasy, all at the same time. But there's something crucial about the Tsar Bomba that the common public never really considered. In reality, if examined rationally, the Tsar Bomba, while horrifically powerful, was completely useless in a practical sense beyond its ability to generate fear. The same massive size that allowed the Tsar Bomba to be so powerful also meant that it was far too heavy and unwieldy to ever actually be launched at a foreign target. It couldn't be mounted on a ballistic missile, so it had to be carried by a massive airplane, and this meant it could be easily shot down before it ever even came close to enemy territory, potentially while it was still flying over Soviet airspace. Ironically, this meant that the bomb's existence was arguably actually a far bigger threat to the Soviet people than it ever was to any foreign power, due to the small potential for accidents or sabotage. And as you'll see in this video, this is a trend that extends beyond the Tsar Bomba and actually tends to apply to the Soviet Union's, and now especially modern Russia's, nuclear program at large. To this very day, modern Russia still relies on old Soviet-era nuclear tests as one of its main geopolitical tools. For example, as they were getting ready to invade Ukraine, Russia made sure to release never-before-seen footage of the Tsar Bomba explosion just to make sure global dread was at its maximum possible level, as if Russia today could unleash the same terror at will. Then, after their invasion of Ukraine, Russia has increasingly relied on nuclear threats specifically as a lever to scare major opponents like the United States into staying largely out of the conflict, only contributing in limited ways. In recent days, Vladimir Putin has been threatening nuclear warfare as often as he possibly can, anytime he doesn't get exactly what he wants on the international stage. And Russian propaganda television back home plays its part as well, constantly depicting Russia nuking other countries, particularly Poland, for some reason. But these constant threats have begun to cause Putin to be seen not as one of the world's most powerful, threatening leaders, but instead as just the boy who cried wolf. Putin's threats are so prolific that he has already threatened nuclear war on at least 40 different occasions, making it difficult and almost dumbfounding to believe that there are some people who still fail to see him as the real provocateur behind the Ukraine conflict. In fact, Putin's threats of world annihilation are so common that some experts, such as those at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, have argued that these frequent threats actually prove that Russia doesn't see its nuclear arsenal as a real tactical option, since every time they produce a threat and don't follow through, the strength of the threat becomes weaker. In other words, if Russia really thought their nukes were a viable option to use, they wouldn't threaten to use them so much. And like the Tsar Bomba that Putin tried to resurrect, Russia's modern nukes are more about psychological warfare than they are about practical on-the-ground facts. These arguments have some serious weight, because, notably, Putin has never followed through on any of his more than 40 nuclear threats. And this is despite numerous different instances where, according to Russia's own statements, he should have done so. Looking back now to Novaya Zemlya and its prolific explosive history, what is perhaps the most surprising thing of all is that Putin has not only never detonated a nuclear weapon on his geopolitical opponents, but he has actually never detonated one at all, period. That may come as a surprise to some, but for all its bluff and bluster, Russia hasn't actually demonstrated to the world that they have a functional nuke since the Soviet Union's last nuclear test over 30 years ago, a test that took place with missiles that have long since passed the point where extensive maintenance would be needed for them to remain in working order today. Now, before we get ahead of ourselves, that doesn't mean that Russia doesn't have any working nukes. That would be a bad assumption, and that's not what this video is saying, or what it will say. So don't go leaving those angry comments before you've even absorbed and considered the actual argument of the video. You know who you are. That aside, while Russia's lack of nuclear tests might not mean they have no functioning nukes, it does help imply something, especially since these facts don't exist in a vacuum. When the Soviet Union collapsed more than 30 years ago, it drastically changed the country's borders, leadership, and power structure. And since then, Russia's nuclear program has experienced a lot of changes, to say the least. Some of these changes have led many analysts to a rather interesting belief, the belief that there is a massive gap between the general public's perception of Russia's nukes, which is still largely informed by decades-old Soviet-era propaganda, and the actual on-the-ground reality of Russia's current nuclear preparedness. The most obvious change following the collapse of the Soviet Union was the initial and immediate collapse of the Soviet Union's nuclear capability. When this monolithic union split up into several different independent nations, a large part of their former nuclear arsenal left Russia's control, leaving much of the world highly concerned. And during this time, Russia lost a lot of their nuclear capacity and never quite gained it back. This wasn't just true in terms of numbers of warheads, but it was also true in terms of expertise. Soviet brain drain was a real thing, as many of their most educated experts left the country as soon as it was possible to safely do so. It was a Wild West era, to be sure. For example, if you watched the Netflix documentary Turning Point, you may have learned about something called Project Sapphire, a desperate effort to recover enriched uranium from Kazakhstan that locals were selling from literal open buckets after the country fell out of Soviet control. And many other similar insane stories could be told. To help prevent total chaos during this time period, the US and Europe took up a large role monitoring and maintaining Russia's nukes, until the country was stable enough to manage them on their own. And interestingly, while Russia is now saying that they have invaded Ukraine in part because of the desire of the United States to place nukes on Ukrainian territory, the truth is actually the opposite, since as part of their actions during this time period, the US actually convinced Ukraine to give their nukes back to Russia, which Ukraine gave in exchange for security guarantees. Since handing the nukes back to Russian control, an indication of the West's actual goodwill towards Russia, the world has watched and seen how Russia has done very little with those nukes in terms of further maintenance and development. Since the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia's nuclear stockpile has drastically decreased, and what remains has been rapidly aging, with many reports suggesting that Russia's supposedly modern stockpile is actually largely puffed up with older, likely non-functional warheads from the Soviet era. Gee, we've never heard that one before. Except, of course, we have. This idea shouldn't be surprising, because this is the exact same thing Russia has done with tanks and armored vehicles on the front line in Ukraine, where they initially told the world they had a much larger number than they actually did, and then pulled old Soviet-era gear out of storage as a band-aid solution when they ran out of modern stuff that actually worked. This situation has been extremely well documented, including by this YouTube channel. But how do we actually know this is true of Russia's nuclear arsenal? Well, there's a lot of data points supporting this idea. Consider, for example, the cost of maintaining a modern nuclear arsenal. Russia, according to official figures, has a rather large one. Their nuclear arsenal is said to include approximately 5,600 warheads, which is a decent amount more than what is held by the United States, whose nuclear arsenal hovers at approximately 5,000 warheads. However, the idea that Russia actually has more functioning warheads than the United States is extremely questionable, to say the least. As just one data point, in 2021, the year before Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States spent approximately $50 billion just maintaining its 5,000 nuclear warheads. That same year, Russia spent $60 billion, just $10 billion more, not just on maintaining its 5,600 nuclear warheads, but on its total military expenditure, including their Air Force, Navy, Army, research and development, manufacturing, logistics, human resources, and much, much more. In comparison, to fund all of these things in 2021, the US spent $753 billion. So there's an obvious disparity there. Even worse, as became apparent when Russia invaded Ukraine, much of their military budget wasn't actually even spent, but was instead embezzled to purchase things like yachts, mansions, and designer clothing. The actual budget that ended up being spent for the intended military purposes, nobody really knows. But obviously, Russia has not been spending nearly enough to maintain a nuclear arsenal at nearly the size they claim to have, which tells the entire world, up front, that Russia has already been caught in a verifiable lie about their nuclear capability. And what do you do when you know somebody is a liar? Well, you don't believe them. And that's especially true when there's an obvious incentive for further deception. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, you get the picture. Russia's insufficient budget doesn't just impact the state of Russia's existing arsenal, but perhaps most importantly, it also kneecaps its modernization, as a nuclear force that isn't capable of maintaining the arsenal it has certainly couldn't be seen as being capable of properly scaling into the future and keeping pace with competitors. But exactly how bad are things? Well, they could be much worse than many people realize. One of the first videos we ever made on this channel explored how extensive the corruption in the Russian military really is. In that video, we noted how, across vast swaths of the military, soldiers were found equipped with fake equipment, which they actually took into battle with them, producing predictable results. This fake equipment was so prevalent for one key reason. The money to create the real gear had been stolen and siphoned off, because there was a belief that a real war would never actually happen, and that the equipment of warfare would therefore never actually be needed. Obviously, that was wrong. But the way the people in charge thought, all that was needed was to maintain enough real weapons to serve as a deterrent, or to use in things like training and parades for demonstration purposes. So when the actual shocks of war descended on the supply chain, then the military found themselves scrambling at all levels, with not nearly enough real, functioning gear to effectively get the job done. This, in turn, ensured that Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine was not nearly as effective as was planned, and here we are now, 2.5 years into what was supposed to be a 3-week or less special military operation. But imagine if the same type of thing occurred when your nation was planning to enter nuclear warfare. If all of this was the case with relatively petty gear, like firearms, tires, or explosives, we can only imagine how that logic may have been applied to Russia's nuclear arsenal as well, where the volumes of money being spent are truly massive, likely making it the ultimate victim of the "we'll probably never need these, so why spend any actual money on them" type of arguments. Just like the world witnessed in nearly every other category of Russian military equipment, it's quite possible that somewhere in Russia, there is a commander who has chosen to keep a small subset of nuclear bombs in good condition, to be used for training or propaganda purposes. The money for all the other nukes could then be either grafted off or never allocated in the first place, as part of an explicitly Russian strategy to look strong without having to make the huge investments necessary to actually be strong. This probably wouldn't be the first time Russia did this, either. After the Cold War, several reports came out that Russia had vastly overstated its nuclear arsenal, on purpose, to force the United States to overinvest in countering it. The recent Netflix documentary, Turning Point, actually posits this theory. There were even other reports that the nuclear missiles on display in Soviet parades weren't actually nuclear at all, or even missiles at all, but simple shells used for demonstration purposes, pulled around the block over and over again once they were out of sight, to give the appearance of an endlessly large arsenal. Those are compelling reports, but hard to verify. But what's not hard to verify is that there are many places in the nuclear process for corruption and graft to potentially take place. One example is when replacing something called tritium, which must be recycled every 5 to 10 years as just one piece of a complicated nuclear missile. At least every 10 years, for every Russian nuke that uses tritium, it costs $100,000 to replace it. Finding a way to pocket that cash instead would be very tempting for a Russian military professional, given that the average pre-war pay for a Russian lieutenant was just under $11,000 per year. Side note, someone really should have told Tucker Carlson that before he filmed his gotcha video in a Moscow grocery store. Yeah, groceries might be half the price there, but if wages are less than a quarter what people make in the US, surprise, surprise, people are actually spending a whole lot more to eat. Back to the point, tritium is just one of thousands of parts in a nuclear missile. The possibility of any one in a variety of these parts being subject to corruption that compromises the weapon, but which is difficult to notice until the weapon is actually fired and tested, is quite high. And since Russia hasn't been able to test a nuclear detonation in over 30 years due to nuclear test ban treaties, you begin to see why this is such a big deal. It could very well be the case that Russia's nuclear stock is sitting stripped and depleted, and that not even the Russian government would fully realize that until they pushed the fateful button. Exactly what happened with their conventional military when they invaded Ukraine. And given this situation, there's essentially no way for Russia to be confident that their nukes will actually work at a sufficient scale to use them. Actually, given how extensively their military corruption was exposed when they invaded Ukraine, they are probably terrified of exactly that outcome. Now, this is the point in the argument where most people will say, that might all be true, but all it takes is one nuke to destroy a city, so we should still be pretty terrified of Russia's nuclear capabilities. Some people say that if only 10% of Russia's nukes work, that's still a big problem, because 10% of 5,600 still lets you take out a whole lot of big cities. And technically speaking, this is true, and I don't blame people for thinking this way. After all it takes is one oops for New York or London or Washington, D.C. to completely disappear from the face of the earth, forever. And that's potentially tens of millions of lives at stake. But on deeper analysis, this view is not exactly correct. To understand why, let's back up just a tiny bit. Back in the Cold War, you may recall that the Soviet Union and the United States got into a massive nuclear arms race, stocking up as many nuclear missiles as possible so as to always have a functioning, redundant stock as needed, something that came to be known as mutually assured destruction. At its peak, the US had an absolutely massive stockpile of over 31,000 nuclear warheads, 6 times larger than what they have today, while the Soviet Union later achieved a stockpile of nearly 45,000 nuclear warheads, or at least that's what they claimed to have on paper. At the time, they did this for what appeared to be a good reason. You see, when it comes to nuclear war, it is widely understood that you can't just fire one nuke, or even a few. Because of the certainty of large-scale nuclear retaliation, if you're going to fire a nuke, you actually have to fire a whole lot of nukes all at once. The idea is that you need to be certain that you can wipe out your enemy's nuclear stockpile before they can wipe out yours. Otherwise, your entire country will be hit in retaliation, and the entire endeavor will be a whole lot more than simply wasted. Firing one, or a small number of nukes, is a surefire way, pun intended, to see your entire country burn with very little to show for it. In other words, it's simply not worth it if you could ever even consider nuclear warfare as worth it in the first place. During the Cold War, of course, the world ultimately decided that nuclear warfare wasn't worth it, so it didn't happen. And if the world already decided that nuclear warfare didn't make sense under circumstances of mutually assured destruction, how could it make sense if the best Russia could hope for was partially assured destruction against its opponents and total assured destruction against itself? For Russia, no matter what the geopolitical situation, there is simply no advantage they can gain by bombing a few major cities, if the end result is that their entire country is completely demolished, while their opponents face a still very terrible, but highly contained disaster that allows them to keep on ticking. So for Russia to launch a nuke would be more of a threat to Russia than it would be to anyone else, and I'm confident that Russia themselves also knows this, more than anyone. At the end of the day, without confidence your nuclear arsenal will work, as a whole, you will likely never have the confidence to push the big red button in the first place. And that's the ultimate cost of operating one of the most corrupt countries on Earth. At some point, your corruption reaches a limit, you're left without options, and everything crashes in on itself. But what do you think? The topics covered in this video are incredibly important, and rarely discussed in mainstream media. So this took a whole lot of work and research to develop. If you appreciated this perspective, I'd appreciate it if you'd consider supporting this channel and our future videos by becoming a patron. Just scan the QR code on screen or visit the link in the description of this video for more information. Russia's nukes aren't the only thing in Russia suffering right now. Their economy, demographics, and much more are facing similar problems. So for more about that, be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and check out my other videos. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video.